Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Podcast Land. And welcome back to me, back to you, back to us. This is the Back to Me podcast, where we're talking about wellness and the myriad of ways to have, achieve, pursue, explore, and, have wellness for yourself. And today's super fabulous guest is Vicki Paris Goodman, who wrote a book called To Sam with Love. And I know that you're going to be interested in hearing what this is about because I was. So welcome, Vicki. It's so nice to meet you.
Oh, thank you, Heather. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we spoke briefly about what you're working on and what you're doing. The first thing I'm always super curious about, though, is what led you to here to write the book. And you can give a little bit of like where the story, I don't know where the story starts. Maybe we won't start at birth, but somewhere where the story starts. And your website is inspiredgrief.com, like how this all came about. And yeah, how was that all working out?
Well, I'll tell you, it was all pretty divinely inspired. And what's stunning about that is that I was raised in a very secular household and believed basically nothing, spiritually speaking or religiously speaking, until sometime before my husband passed in 2019. I remember he was raised pretty much the way I was, but on opposite coasts. And, we had decided that atheism or even a strong agnosticism didn't really make a whole lot of sense since all that we were experiencing around us just we couldn't see how it could have just spontaneously come about. Okay. So we had started to believe in a higher power, even though we'd been raised not to. But I hadn't taken that very far at the point where Sam passed in 2019. But suddenly, after he passed, I needed to believe. I found that I needed to believe in something. And I needed it to be a strong belief, and I needed to find out a whole lot more about the afterlife. And what's interesting is even on the day Sam passed, I expected to be lost for a while, even though I'm basically a survivor type. But even on the day he passed, I was suddenly flooded with optimism. It was unseemly. I felt like, oh, no. I felt like I should push it away. But then I thought, I was so strong during our 2-year ordeal from his diagnosis to his passing. And I took good care of him at the end when he needed taking care of. And I thought, if good things want to come my way, even on the day Sam passed, maybe I should let them. It was like a helping hand was coming from somewhere outside of myself to guide me forward, to lead me to whatever was to come. And it turned out to be a great decision to let myself be led because a lot of wondrous things happened. There were serendipitous occurrences that happened, kind of signs from the afterlife that I was so happy to receive. There were opportunities coming my way, things that I thought, oh, I've always wanted to do that. And I felt motivated to embrace them. And then the insights began. And after some time, it occurred to me, these weren't coming from within myself. These were coming from somewhere outside myself. And what I really believe is that God has chosen me for whatever reason, maybe a certain skill set. I write fairly well, I speak fairly well. It's all the more believable because I was raised so secular. Whatever the reasons are, it's as if I was chosen to be the messenger of this powerful message that I know will help others who are facing any kind of adversity, really, but especially the loss of a loved one, like a spouse.
Right. So for the people who were suddenly went, wait, what? So Sam was your spouse. And I guess, how long were you married?
We were married just under 22 years. We got married pretty late in life. Yeah.
It's a good chunk of time, though, to, have someone so integrated into your life and become part of your days, right? And I found it super interesting that you said, this optimism was coming to you and you felt like you had to push it away. And it made me think, like, we have this idea in our heads that we are supposed to suffer. And I find that, I'm saying it out loud and I'm kind of laughing because I know people suffer. I know there's suffering happening, but there are times in your life where we suffer and we don't have to. You can choose. You were mourning your husband. I mean, you missed him, but does that mean you have to suffer? Is that why you felt like you were pushing it away?
Well, on the day he passed, which is when this optimism just came flooding in, I had yet to experience all of this guidance coming my way, all of the insights that I now have that are part of the message that I need to put out to the world, because I know it is helping others and will help many more. It's been said that this message of mine, which we haven't even begun to talk about
I know.
yet, is a movement, or should be. Now, to address what you just said, Heather, there's a strong, very powerful cultural conditioning for us to think of death and loss and grief in a particular way. And it's not a good way. It keeps a lot of people guilty if they feel inclined to move on too soon. And that means something different to each person. But there's this concept of it's too soon. And almost everyone who loses, say, a spouse or anyone who really meant a lot to them has a concept of what's too soon. So there's all this guilt involved. And my message completely explodes that entire notion of this cultural conditioning that has taught us to awfulize death, to think that there's something in the way of a too soon to move on and be happy. And so I'm here to just completely upend that entire set of beliefs so that people can know that the reality is we don't have to survive a loss in that way. It can be far more positive and should be.
Right. I'm just thinking of when women had to be dressed in black after their spouse died for a year or their whole lives. It's like, wow. Everything soon for them. It's like, really? So, yes, let's talk about how this is all wrong. So, what is this message that you are upending the world with?
All right. So soon after Sam passed, as I said, I wanted to know a lot more about the afterlife. And I had the chaplain from the hospice we used available to me about once a month for an entire year after Sam passed. And I said yes to that. And she and I would get together, and I started almost immediately asking questions about the afterlife. And she recommended a story for me to read, the story of a secular neurosurgeon. They know all about the brain and what it's capable of under various conditions. He had suddenly this massive brain infection. He's in a coma for 7 days and he has a near-death experience. Now, he was going to die. His colleagues were taking care of him in the hospital. They could not get this infection under control and he was going to die. And they told his family, you better hope he dies because if he survives this, he's going to have such massive brain damage that he's going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life. So they were really preparing for him to pass anytime now. Well, long story short, he survives not only to write the book and tell his story, but to resume his career as a neurosurgeon, no brain damage whatsoever. The whole thing was divinely inspired, kind of as my story is, because there was no way for him to contract this infection either. He didn't have a wound of the type that's necessary in order for this particular type of infection to even enter his body. So it occurred to me from reading his story that God was using him kind of the way I'm being employed by God now to get a message out, to get his message out. Made all the more believable by the fact that he didn't believe anything before he had this near-death experience. He was also raised very secular and had never veered off of that course until this infection happened and the near-death experience. So what's great about my having read his story is a couple of things. Number one, it made me understand so much, and I found it so compelling and convincing that it brought me the rest of the way very quickly to believing fully in God and an afterlife. The other great thing that happened from reading his story is that there were a whole lot of things that I was able to infer as I wrote my book from what he said, not things he actually said, but sort of things I was able to extrapolate from what he said that made me take certain things in his story further and develop my own message from them. And then, combined with the insights that God was providing to me, it became a cohesive message. And what's interesting is some of the strongest insights, some of the most compelling insights that I received came to me after I wrote the book. So they're in an audio episode, and we'll talk, and I've already begun talking about them, but they're in an audio episode that I will offer toward the end of our talk here today, Heather. So, okay, so we awfulize death because we're culturally conditioned to. But if there's a loving God and an exquisitely beautiful afterlife, and if God has a plan for each one of us, and if part of that plan is in almost all cases for one spouse, let's say, to predecease the other. I mean, it doesn't happen very often that they're both killed at the same time in a car crash or a plane crash. Most of the time, one predeceases the other. And all it means is that the surviving spouse has more to do, more to learn, more to experience, and perhaps, as in my case, things to teach others. And so if God has this plan for us, why are we postponing moving forward with that plan by grieving so hard and so long and suffering through it? It makes no sense. Now, what's interesting is when I've told this to people I know who believe in God, most of the people I know do, they nod knowingly. And I'm thinking, okay, so most people seem to already know this, but I guess the cultural conditioning is so powerful that we still buy into the awfulization of death. We become so sad when someone we love passes. And we become so sad for others we know who have people who pass into the afterlife. And I'm thinking, this doesn't make any sense. Now, I was an engineer, so everything has to conform to a certain logic for me, and I'm thinking to myself, this does not compute. And so really, I think what it is we fail to connect the dots because the cultural conditioning is so strong on one side. And these things we know, it's almost like we know them, but we say, well, we don't question why these things that we know, if we have this belief system in God and an afterlife, we don't really question why they don't conform with the cultural conditioning that has us behaving a certain way when someone passes.
Well, it's funny because I think people will say, oh, yes, I understand intellectually. Like the people that that say, yes, I believe in God, they understand intellectually, yes, there's this afterlife and everything. That's fine. But that doesn't mean you should take away my people. I don't want my people to die because I'll be sad. Like they haven't connected that dot of, well, they've just left this incarnation kind of thing, right? It's like they haven't, you're right. There's a connection there missing between I understand, but I still don't want it to happen because I'm supposed to be sad or I'm going to be sad.
Yeah, now let me clarify something. It's not that I didn't grieve. I did. One of the things that happened was I was moving along in a much more positive frame of mind soon after Sam passed. I was trying new things. I was traveling to exotic places I probably couldn't have gone if Sam had not passed, because, like I went to Antarctica. He didn't like cold weather vacations, So it's not that I didn't grieve. I did. In fact, part of the reason I wanted to know about the afterlife after he passed is as a coping mechanism. And another thing I did was I read the last greeting card he gave me, which he gave me a few months before he passed, because reading it every single night before bed for an entire year made me feel better, So it's not that I didn't grieve, but one insight that came to me very recently, like just a few weeks ago, really, was that I think our grief is kind of bifurcated into two pieces. And it's only one piece that I believe is unnecessary. And that's the loss of the actual person, because they're not gone. Their body dies, their brain dies, but their soul lives on in the afterlife. And I have some pretty good evidence that Sam is still hanging around. So, that's one thing. I think the legitimate grief is over what happens to your life. There are big changes when this person you loved, and especially if it's a spouse who you shared your home with, and they're suddenly not physically present anymore. So what I did was I established a balance between what I call activities and alone time or quiet time, because you have to process what's happened to your life. And a lot of people will tell you, and this will be well-intended advice, they'll say, keep yourself so busy you don't have time to think or feel. Well, I instinctively knew that however well-intended that advice was, it was bad advice, and I ignored
bad
it.
Advice for everything.
Yeah, I ignored it. And instead I established this balance so that I could spend some quiet time each day processing what had happened in my life. And it turned out to be a wonderful balance. The only thing wrong with it, and there's no remedy for this that I know of, is that I would have all this fun. I'd, meet a friend for lunch. I'd go to karaoke. I'd go to an orchestra rehearsal, whatever I was doing, all these fun things, I'd come home and feel empty inside. Nothing had any meaning. And I thought, oh, that's because Sam's not here anymore to share things with. And I thought, well, I don't want to start a new relationship anytime soon. So, I don't feel ready for that, nowhere near. In fact, it took me almost 2 years to feel ready for that. And some people never feel like they want to start a new relationship after losing their spouse. So, it's an individual thing. So nothing had any meaning. And I told myself, Vicki, you're doing exactly the right thing. You're on the right path. It just feels right in every way. It's not perfect. It's not great. It's good, but it's not great. And it's just not going to be for a while. And I accepted that. And I thought, okay, so I'm going to feel a little lonely at night when I come home after having a bunch of fun. Not so terrible. And there wasn't any alternative. Now, this balance I created, Heather, was actually put to the test, because Sam passed in July of 2019. And what hit just a few months later?
Oh,
COVID.
yeah. Right.
So suddenly that balance between activity and quiet time was upset. And I'd been doing so well, but I was spending too much time home alone. Fortunately, I had some friends that were ignoring everything, and we were having get-togethers, and that helped a lot. But it's still the balance was still too much on alone time, and combined with anxiety and uncertainty from all this COVID stuff that we didn't really get a handle on what was happening for many months. Well, I suffered 3 depressions in the next, I don't know, 6 months to a year. They were each precisely 10 days long. I'd sit in my living room staring out the window. It was awful, 3 of them. And that hadn't happened until COVID. So that balance had worked really well. And that's a
Yeah,
tip I would have for survivors, incidentally.
right.
Yeah.
That being able to be like have community. Like I think community is an important part of anybody's wellness, not just if you are grieving something or someone, right? Community, we shy away from it when we're like upset. We're like, I don't just want to be alone, but that's the last time to be alone,
Right.
right?
I agree.
You need people to help you hold that energy. I'm interested. So this is just something that I find interesting. So do you believe in the Christian God, the Christian version?
Okay. Good question. I would say yes or no. I don't know enough about it. Honestly, I have made this up as I go along. Remember how I said that that helping hand was guiding me almost from the basically starting on the day Sam passed. What I was led to do is start asking questions about the afterlife. I was led to read the book about the neurosurgeon. I was led in so many ways, and this control freak let herself be led, which is the other amazing thing. Somehow I was led to allow myself to be led. It was that's what was so divinely inspired about this, because this wasn't me. It really wasn't me. It's not me to spend a good portion of my retirement trying to get a helpful message out to the world. None of this was the Vicki before Sam passed. So, given that this isn't my nature, or it wasn't, and I'm having a wonderful time doing it, it just feels right. So, you asked a question, what God do I believe in? I just believe in God and an afterlife. I haven't taken it too much further than that.
That's
And
valid because I have this feeling that all religions are partly right and partly wrong. So I think they all have at their core a seed of the possibility, but that the human brain can't really get the whole thing. Like they can't really encompass all that is in this. I call it the universe, divine, whatever. And it was interesting because there's a book on our bookshelf, which I will admittedly I haven't read, but I know what it's about. It's called The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And he's talking about how can there be a one almighty God that allows things like childhood leukemia and all these terrible things. And I'm like, I'm in this place where I'm thinking, well, there's a purpose behind that. And we can't know what it is at this point of our evolution.
well, if you'd like a hint as to one of the other uh, insights with which I was blessed, it
Just
has
tell
to
me.
do with it has to do with adversity. And why do we suffer so much adversity? And maybe there's a better way to look at adversity in this life. So this is another thing that I'm glad you brought up, because I may have forgotten to bring it up myself. And that is that with adversity, I'm convinced it's all a part of God's plan to teach us things. And, I've spent so much of my prior secular life just kind of pouting about adverse circumstances. Boy, did I waste a lot of time. Now I see this completely differently. Now, no matter what adverse event happens, whether it be just a bad hair day or something really awful, like the passing of a spouse, or maybe your house burns down. I mean, there are terrible things that happen to people. There's a lesson. And my advice is to think about it right away as soon as the adverse event happens, because in my experience, I can usually figure out what that lesson is, and it doesn't take a whole lot of thought. Oh yeah, I think I know what God's trying to teach me with this one. And I also think it's possible that the sooner you learn that lesson, the sooner God will stop trying to teach you that lesson. Now he may move on to another one.
There's endless lessons to learn, right?
Yes.
And I do agree with you. Like, even no matter what terminology you use, I mean, when I had my stroke and I was in the hospital, it was what am I supposed to be learning here? Which is where my podcast came from. And when I fell in December and broke my wrist when I was on vacation, I was in Jordan of all places, and everybody was saying, "Oh, how terrible." I'm like, "No, it was fascinating. You wouldn't believe all the things that I found out and learned and got to experience." So when you have that, it is adversity. What does do you know who Esther Hicks is?
No.
She channels the entity Abraham. So Abraham you can see it on YouTube. Abraham, I went to see them last year in Denver, and people ask Abraham questions, and I think it's just the voice of spirit, divine, answering people's questions. They've just chosen to call themselves Abraham, and Abraham calls it contrast instead of adversity. Your life is full of contrast to highlight for you where you maybe should shift your focus.
Mm-hmm.
Contrast is a good word.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I now believe in all of these things because I've read a few more near-death experiences. For example, I see that they have certain things in common. I see that they vary in certain ways, and I have a hypothesis about that, why they vary from one another. And again, something I extrapolated from what the neurosurgeon said. He describes having arrived in the afterlife in his near-death experience, and he calls it the earthworm's eye view. He describes being in this mud. It's unpleasant. There's this loud banging noise. And, I didn't know what to make of that at the time. But a couple of years later, after experiencing so much of what we're talking about, of my experience after Sam passed, it occurred to me that some people who have near-death experiences go to the afterlife and they immediately see the tunnel with the light. He was there for a while before he got to that point. And I'm thinking, well, that makes sense. He was raised secular. He had no belief system at the point when he got there. Maybe God places you in a not so pleasant place to begin with, at a lower level, if that makes any sense. And you have to kind of fight to get out of there by shifting your belief system somewhat.
He puts you in the waiting room.
Kinda. And so, I've been developing sort of a hypothesis about that, but it's going to take me viewing YouTube videos about a lot more near-death experiences to kind of hone it, and fine-tune it. But
right.
But yeah, I think I might be onto something.
There was a book that I read, actually read in quotation marks, because most of the books that I do are audiobooks, because I just find them easier to consume. And this was a hypnotherapist who would help people, like he would do past life regressions. And he found that at one point he was asking someone questions about where they were, and they were kind of in an in-between space. Michael Newton, Journey of Souls. And he now has documented all of these people and from all different walks of life. And it's like you said, it's very similar, but some people enter it into in a different place, and it's like almost like it's a bit too foggy. They can't get through. So I just thought it was like, that'd be an interesting thing for you to check out, that book, Journey of Souls.
Yeah.
And and he's very interesting in what people are, who comes to meet you, and because he's talked to people who's like somebody who they recognize from their current life comes to meet them, even though it's not, like, theoretically that was just one of their incarnations. So it's very interesting how that all unfolds in that book, and how, even though they're all very different, they're very similar. And I think that the faster that people can learn to be in alignment with whatever the purpose was that was they sent you here for, maybe the less adversity, contrast you have to suffer through. It's like, you're a bad kid, you're going to detention. Shh, here's your lesson.
You could extrapolate this whole thing about negating the awfulization of death and seeing it in a much more positive light. You could even extrapolate that to say, gee, maybe passing sooner as opposed to later is even a good thing. Maybe it's a reward from God that some of us are lucky enough to pass into the afterlife sooner. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities here, and I don't have all the answers, but there are an awful lot of things that are beginning to make sense to me. But I guess the main thing is that people suffer needlessly. Of that much, I'm convinced. I expected to suffer a lot more than I did after losing the love of my life. Sam was a wonderful man. He was just a near perfect human being, about as perfect as they come. He was very, I guess, morally disciplined. He believed in doing the right thing in every circumstance, no matter what it cost him. He was philosophically disciplined, and he was also very funny with the perfect comic timing and delivery. So he was just a great person that everyone loved. And you could look at that as an enormous loss for me. But it's interesting how these things happened after he passed that so greatly diminished how terrible the loss was, to the point where I don't view it as terrible at all anymore. Now, just the other day was 5 years since Sam passed, so I have some distance from this event at this point. The reason I wrote the book, Heather, was because after 2 years of insights and serendipitous events and opportunities that I grasped, and I thought, this story could help other people. So the full title of the book is To Sam with Love, a surviving spouse's story of inspired grief. And a couple of people said inspired grief, and it is kind of an oxymoron. But I kept that phrase in the subtitle because it seemed to perfectly describe what I experienced. And I thought, it's a little unusual. Maybe it'll make people interested in finding out what that's all about.
Right.
So what I did was, when I wrote the book, I kind of divided it into thirds roughly. I wanted to tell people about Sam's life, a little of my own, and our time together. And that part of the book is actually very uplifting. People said, you managed to make the book funny in places. How did you do that? Given your topic. They said none of it's depressing, and it's all, except for, maybe the part where Sam passes, because by that time we've gotten to know him, and it was, so I shed a tear over that. But there's no part of the book that's really at all depressing. It's uplifting. People said it was a page turner. I was so gratified to get these comments on my first book. So the first part is about our lives together. And I'm pretty self-deprecating because I'm far less perfect than Sam. So, in contrast to him, there were a lot of things that made me look not so good, and I had fun with those. I thought, hey, I'm telling it all. I don't care, and so let people laugh at me. That's fine. And then the middle third of the book is from diagnosis to Sam's passing. And the latter third or so is about all these unexpected positive things that happened for me after he passed. And so, it's instructive, it's a fun read, it's a quick read, and I'm really happy with the feedback I've gotten on it.
And can they get that on your website, or is it on Amazon? Or
Oh, okay. It is on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but the best place to get it, because I have it discounted there, is at my domain inspiredgrief.com/book.
right, I'll
Well,
put it in the show notes too, for sure.
Right. Now, my website, my author website, VickiParisGoodman.com, is also worth going to. You can contact me there. There's a contact form, but there's some blog articles that are on this subject, but mostly on other subjects that I think are insightful reads as well. And then I also have
audio. I heard you say something about you had audio insights.
Yeah, the audio episode. Thank you. I have a private podcast audio series, 3 audio episodes, about 12 to 15 minutes each. They're packed with some of the insights which we began to talk about today, insights that came to me after I published the book. I thought, oh, I've already published the book. Now what do I do? Well, they're in the audio episodes and they're really good. And so those are at inspiredgrief.com. And all you have to do is put in your first name and your email address. And I would encourage you to do that now. It'll take you all of 30 seconds, and just subscribe to it now before you forget.
Right. I know. I always have these good plans and write myself Post-it notes, and then I'll find them a few weeks later and go, oh, shoot, I didn't do that yet. So
I know.
Do it when you think of it, because your brain is a factory, not a warehouse. And
yes, go now.
Fall out the side.
Go now, inspiredgrief.com.
Go now. Run. Unless you're driving, don't go now.
Pull over.
Yeah, pull over. So it sounds like I'm interested in, there's more insights to come. I think they're going to just keep coming to you. And I can tell it's like, this is just the beginning of more and more and more that is coming, more expansion that is coming for you. If you were going to leave our guests with a word of wisdom, you can have more than one word. What would it be?
If you lose your spouse or anyone who means a lot to you, create that balance between activity and quiet time. Process the loss while you're having the time of your life, and go ahead and do it. Oh, one other insight here that I think people would benefit from that I forgot to talk about, and that is that it's very clear from another thing I extrapolated from the neurosurgeon. God, there was so much. Souls in the afterlife, given that they are surrounded by this all-encompassing love that is so powerful and beautiful that we can't even begin to conceive what it's like here on earth, they can't possibly experience negative emotions. They only want what's best for us. So, I spoke to one lady who told me, she said, I would love to start a new relationship, but if I entered into a new sexual relationship, I'd be afraid that my husband was watching from the afterlife. And I said, oh, you can bet on it. And I said, and it's a good thing. He wants you to be happy, and he wants you to be fulfilled, and he wants you to have the best life possible. And I know that to be true. We don't have enough time to go into the rest of that, but I did talk to her at length about this. And I said, I'll hope you consider what I've said, because there is no reason for you to be afraid to enter into a new relationship, even a sexual one, because of your husband watching from the afterlife.
Right.
And she said, okay, I'll think about that. And yeah, so that's one thing. Now, the only other thing I would say is to be open to being led after you lose someone. If it was available to me, it's got to be available to others, and just make the decision to to be open and be open to opportunities that come your way, to do wonderful, fun things. Maybe things that you stopped doing before, maybe things you've always wanted to do that you haven't had time for, but now you do. Have the best life possible.
Right. I think that's a fabulous way to end a podcast. Have the fabulous life possible. Ugh, I didn't know that was going to be a tongue twister. Vicki, thank you so much for coming and sharing.
Well, thank you for having me, Heather. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. And everyone, as soon as this is done, run, don't walk, run and download that audio series because
at inspiredgrief.com.
Inspiredgrief.com.
Yeah.
If you're not sure, check the show notes because you might get the I and the E reverse in grief. So
that's true.
Right? Thank you, friends in podcast land. If you know someone who's had a loss and they're stuck in the suffering, share this with them. Subscribe, like, send us some comments, send us some love, and we will see you next time. Take care.